Greetings and good Thursday afternoon, students, colleagues, friends, and supporters here at Florida A&M University, the Rattlers. I'm Valencia Matthews, and I'm delighted to greet you on behalf of the College of Social Sciences, Arts, and Humanities, where I have the privilege and the honor of serving as the Dean. The College of Social Sciences, Arts, and Humanities is comprised of 14 majors, and here we proclaim that we are the conscience of the academy, that we are the keepers of the culture, that we are the protectors of freedom, and that we are the ambassadors of creativity. So everything that we do coalesces around that mantra. So today, very quickly, the Spring Literary Forum is one of FAMU's signature events here at the university. And as they say always, that since 2009, the Literary Forum has brought an interdisciplinary collective, Mr. Escoffery, of renowned writers, artists, and scholars to FAMU's campus to expand the worldviews of our students, our faculty, our alumni, and what we call the Big Bend community. So today, you join that collective, Jonathan Escoffery, and we are so very delighted to have you here. And so what I'm going to do right now, Dr. Yan, is what I do best. I'm going to sit back, I'm going to listen, I'm going to learn, and I know that it's going to be an exciting hour and 15 minutes. So welcome to the College of Social Sciences, Arts, and Humanities, and this event on the Florida A&M University's campus. Thank you.
It's a little bit of a, one imagines a bit of a feeling as we are engaged in this, because we miss out on the feedback of actual rounds of applause. But I mean, I know everybody, Dean Matthews is giving you an round of applause in our hearts and in our minds and in our spirits. Good morning, FAMU. Good morning to the Department of English and Modern Languages. Good morning to the College of Social Sciences, Arts, and Humanities. Good morning to everybody in the Writing Center right now and all over campus and all over the community who is watching and paying attention. My name is Alexander Brickler. I'm an assistant professor in the Department of English and Modern Languages at FAMU. And I cannot say enough how excited I am about the prospect of this year's 15th annual Spring Literary Forum. It's a remarkable moment to be able to showcase a young author at the moment of their debut novel and all of the pomp and circumstance surrounding it. So I have the awesome task of being able to introduce our keynote speaker, Jonathan Escoffery, and a quick tale of North and South to be able to provide a little bit of context before I just give all of his reams of accolades. I met Jonathan, actually, I'm a Floridian myself, I'm North Florida, I'm Tallahassee born. And Jonathan, as all of the promotional material is indicating, is of course from South Florida. And yet and still we met one another both in graduate school at the University of Minnesota Twin Cities. So you travel across the country to meet somebody from downstate, one imagines. And so I met Jonathan in passing as part of the Black Graduate and Professional Student Association gatherings at the University of Minnesota around 2009, 2010. And as a result of that, for me, reading If I Survive You was a fascinating exercise in learning that even the cool kids from down south, down in Miami, can be struggling in the Midwest just as much as my North Florida country bumpkin self was doing. And I find that to be remarkably kind of compelling and a little bit exciting. But of course, to complete the experiences of Trelawney and Jonathan might be less than entirely fair. While the fictional character and protagonist of the novel, the collected stories of the novel, ends his journey on a somewhat ambiguous note, Escoffery's current experiences in the art world seem to be a veritable cavalcade of meteoric successes. All the more reason why we are so completely thrilled to have him with us here today at FAMU. If I Survive You is a debut collection of 8 linked stories focusing on the experiences of a Jamaican immigrant family living in Miami as they navigate place, liminality, family dynamics, and the American mythos. A sometimes funny, sometimes engaging, sometimes retching novel, Escoffery's writing is lively. His well-crafted stories and he's insightful and witty about Miami's multiracial, multicultural, and multilingual population. If I Survive You is a most promising debut, writes Colette Bancroft of the Tampa Bay Times. A national bestseller, If I Survive You is longlisted for the 2023 PEN Gene Stein Open Book Award, the PEN Faulkner Award, the Carnegie Medal for Excellence in Fiction, and the Aspen Woods Literary Prize. It's further longlisted for the 2022 National Book Award for Fiction and a finalist of the 2022 National Book Critics Circle John Leonard Prize, among many other honors. So this is a fire debut. Clearly, we are blessed to have such an august person in our midst this morning. Escoffery's fiction has been featured in the Paris Review, the Best American Magazine Writing, the Prairie Schooner, and other outlets. Raised in Miami, he earned a 2020 National Endowment of Arts Literature Fellowship and the Plimpton Prize for Fiction, among other awards. He is also a fellow at the University of Southern California's PhD Creative Writing and Literature program. Thank you so much, Jonathan, for spending some time with us this morning, and we cannot wait to hear from you. Jonathan Escoffery, thank you very much.
Thank you for those introductions, Dr. Brickler, Dr. Matthews. I really appreciate it. First, let me say how honored I am just to be here speaking with the FAMU community today, to speaking with the faculty, speaking with all of the students. Growing up in Miami, so many of us in the Black community really looked to Florida A&M as a source of inspiration and pride. And that was even if we had no immediate connection to the university, but we knew that it's an institution that cultivates the minds of great thinkers and leaders. I'm here speaking to you today because I wrote a book about a family, a Jamaican family specifically, who decides to emigrate to the United States in the late 1970s to escape the explosion of violence that transformed their native Kingston. It's in Miami, Florida, where they have their second son, Jelani, who struggles to understand where he fits within his family and in the larger context of what he comes to see as an anti-Black America. Jelani's efforts to find his truest self and to reclaim the Jamaica his parents abandoned lead him to falling out with his father, Topper, who kicks him out of his home shortly after Jelani has returned from college. Jelani begins living out of his vehicle, and we follow him as he picks up odd internet jobs that challenge both his ethics and his willingness to survive. I always knew that I wanted to be a published author, but despite being born to Jamaican parents, I didn't think I'd ever write about a family of Jamaicans, or write, for that matter, character-driven fiction. As a young reader, I was really drawn to narratives that presented intricate plots and largely cerebral narrators who made me feel engaged in the mental challenge of a kind of puzzle solving. I wanted to write about adventures that any reader might easily plug themselves into. But what I started to notice about my earlier writing is that the characters I'd attempt to shoehorn into storylines felt generic. And it started to occur to me that I had little firsthand knowledge about the intimate details of what goes on in an American household. And I could only ever offer representations based off of other writers' representations of what it means to be alive in the world, unless I began to write about the world around me as I've experienced it. And it occurred to me that while I've read books that touch on what it's like to emigrate to the US from Jamaica, I'd never heard of a book about what it's like to be the American-born son in a Jamaican family, especially not taking place in Miami, Florida. So I endeavored to write the book that I wanted to see in the world, the book that would have helped me as a younger person when I had my own questions about identity and belonging. And writing the book meant doing a kind of deep dive into my own lived experience, which in a sense has helped me understand it that much better. That's not to say that the book is overly concerned with coming to firm conclusions or providing answers, but more often it deconstructs the answers that we as a society would like to believe that we have already settled on. The book is told through alternating points of view, largely because I wanted to emphasize that there is no one Jamaican or Jamaican American experience, and that even within a given family and even amongst siblings, the perspectives on what it means to be Jamaican or Black in America can be vastly varied. And it was important to me to show how one's relationship with identity can change based on geographic location. As we see in the book, as my characters move from Jamaica to Miami and to the American Midwest. So I want to read from a couple of sections from the book. That way, myself and our audience today can have a kind of shared text. I'm going to read from a very short portion of the book that speaks to the dilemma and challenge of the second generation Caribbean American immigrant, and the challenges of belonging and maintaining self-esteem within the American context. This is from a story in the book that is titled Independent Living. And at this point in the book, it's kind of jumping forward. It's the middle of the book. At this point in the book, Trelawney's had a falling out with his father that's left him essentially unhoused, living out of his vehicle. But he takes a job working at a government subsidized elderly housing apartment building. And he's looking for a promotion in order to secure that kind of upward mobility. And in order to put a house over a roof over his head again. But in this portion, the context is that he's reflecting on his positionality. And I'll pick up from the text there. It might be hyperbole to say I identify with my tenants, most of whom are asylum seekers and refugees, but I can empathize well enough. My parents came to the US not for economic advancement, but to escape the violence the US government funded in Jamaica throughout the 1970s as part of its war on socialism. But when I say Jamaica to non-Jamaicans, no one thinks of CIA operatives or puppet prime ministers or historical continuity. Instead, they break into free association as if they've been tossed into a rap cipher. Bob Marley, Irie, Ganja, poor people, sandals, Eman. At best, they believe our history began the moment they purchased their all-inclusive vacation package. Of course, the difference between exiles and my parents, in fact, the difference between me and my parents, is that my parents have a homeland to which they can return. Just weeks before I came home from college last year, my mother said, to hell with Miami, with this whole damn country, the rat race, all of it. Let the bank foreclose on her house and dip back to Jamaica. She says she can finally breathe now. She feels freed by the privilege of relative racelessness. In 2009, Kingston's murder rate reached the highest ever on record, and my mom returned there so she could finally feel safe. And I'm departing from the text at this point. It was an important point in the book for me to, in a sense, break through the narrative. And I think as a writer, you're sometimes trying to convey ideas through characters who you're moving around a given storyline. But in a way, I wanted to voice that kind of frustration, because oftentimes I find when I speak to Americans about Jamaica, they often reveal their presumption that all Jamaicans live in poverty and live primarily to serve their vacation needs. And I wanted to write against this because it's a false narrative that serves to ultimately flatten and dehumanize Jamaicans. And I say Jamaicans because that's obviously my personal experience and lineage, but that could be expanded to so many of the Caribbean islands. The family I've written about are middle-class Jamaicans, and it was actually their migration to the United States that began their financial struggle. And it was important that I established in the book that it was the violence that was exacerbated by the American imperialism of the 1970s that and 60s that made the family come to the US in the first place, so that readers understand, most importantly, that violence and poverty are not the natural, essential conditions for Jamaicans. With that said, I want to return to the book so that, again, we get more of a taste of the issues and challenges of that second-born generation in the United States. And again, so we could have a kind of common text. So I'm going to read from the beginning of the book, which starts with a story titled Influx. And with this story, I think because I'm reading an excerpt, I'm just reading from the beginning, I think it's important to understand that this is a conversation that continues on. We're going to mostly see my main character, Trelawney, dealing with his parents' attitudes in his earlier parts of his life, but I think it's important to say that these conversations evolve over time as Trelawney gains more autonomy and as his parents learn a little bit more about what it means to live in the United States over the course of decades, and just not their attitudes upon arrival in the country. So picking up from the story Influx, it begins with, "What are you?" hollered from the perimeter of your front yard when you're 9, younger probably. You'll be asked again throughout junior high and high school, then out in the world, in strip clubs, in food courts, over the phone and at various menial jobs. The askers are expectant. They demand immediate gratification. Their question lifts you slightly off your pre-adolescent toes, tilting you, not just because you don't understand it, but because even if you did understand this question, you wouldn't yet have an answer. Perhaps it starts with, "What language is your mother speaking?" This might be the genesis, not because it comes first, but because, at least on this occasion, you have some context for the question when it arrives. You immediately resent this question. "Why does your mother talk so funny?" your neighbor insists. Your mother calls to you from the front porch, has called from this perch overlooking the sloping yard since you were allowed to join the neighborhood kids in play. Always, this signals that playtime is over. Only now, shame has latched itself to the ritual. Perhaps you'd hoped no one would ever notice. Perhaps you'd never noticed it yourself. Perhaps you ask in shallow protest, "What do you mean, what language?" Maybe you only think it. Ultimately, you mutter, "English. She's speaking English," before going inside, head tucked in embarrassment. In this moment, for the first time, you are ashamed of your mother, and you are ashamed of yourself for not defending her. More than to be cowardly and disloyal, though, it's shameful to be foreign. If you've learned anything during your short residence on Earth, you've learned this. It's America and it's the 80s, and at school, in class, you pledge to one and one flag only, the Stars and Stripes. Greatest country on earth is the morning anthem. It's the lesson plan, a mantra drilled into you day in, day out, a fact as inarguable as 2 + 2 = 4. And what you start to hear as you repeat this to yourself is the implication that all other nations, though other nations are seldom mentioned in school, are inferior. You believe this. It's an easy lesson to internalize, except that your brother Delano, your parents, nearly all your living relatives are Jamaican. When your play cousin moves from Kingston to Miami to your Cutler Ridge neighborhood, winding up in your 3rd grade class, refusing to pledge allegiance to your flag, you know to distance yourself from her. You say a quiet thanks that your last names are different. If you'd had any context for the question of what you are when it first came, you might have answered, American. You were born in the US and you've got the paperwork to prove it. You feel pride in this fact, this inalienable status. You built Lee Greenwood's God Bless the USA on the 4th of July, and even more emphatically after visiting your parents' island nation for 2 weeks in your ninth summer. You disagree with every aspect of the island life, down to the general lack of central air conditioning. You prefer burgers and hot dogs to jerked or curried anything. Back at home, your parents accuse you of speaking and even acting like a real Yankee. But if by Yankee they mean American, you embrace it. I speak English, you respond. Your parents' patois and what many deem an indecipherable accent still play as normal, almost unnoticeable against your ears, except that it is increasingly paired with the punitive. For instance, when your mother says, "Una can spill the thing on the tile, but una can't clean it," and your brother says, "No, me, mommy," and you say, "I didn't do it, mom," she'll say, "Then who did? Must be a duppy." The duppy becomes the scapegoat for all the inexplicable activity that takes place in and outside your house. The duppy broke your mother's vase, then tried to glue it back together. The duppy hid your brother's report card underneath his mattress. The duppy possessed your father, dragged his body out for drinks after work, and didn't bring him home until morning. A duppy, or ghost, or even a grown man can be difficult to discipline, so you and your brother alone share the punishments. In school, when your world geography project is announced and you're made to choose from a list of countries to present on, you choose Mongolia. It's not till another student chooses Jamaica that you consider the tiny island a worthy option. Part of your project requires preparing a dish native to the country you've chosen. This is 4th grade. Your mothers do the cooking. When they meet one another on presentation day, eyes ring dark from having wrestled with foreign recipes late into the night, they nod imperceptibly, too exhausted for pleasantries. As your classmate begins her presentation on Jamaica, your mother sucks her teeth, a sound akin to industrial strength Velcro ripping apart, drawing glances from several of the other parents. "Me could have brought in leftovers," she whispers, leaning in. "If only you chose home." On career day, your father stands in front of your class and identifies himself as a general contractor. The block letter alphabet strung along the edge of the blackboard arcs over his wavy black hair. Below the arch, he unspools a foot of measuring tape with the tip of his thumb, then releases it, causing the tape to zip back into its case. The sharp whiz emitted by the swift violence of the retracted tape gains your classmates' undivided awe. Your father repeats this action several times before deigning to speak. Your classmates hold their breath in anticipation. As he explains that when man need them bathroom fix, is me gets all the plaster and PVC and ting, and is me make the worker man come nice up the place, a string of snickers breaks out from the classroom's back row. Your teacher shushes the students, but as your father continues his speech, her face crinkles, head bobbling to the beat of his patois. You concentrate on the pink surfacing over her cheeks, the color spectrum helping you determine the magnitude of this disaster. If she remains light pink, a shallow blush, a rose petal, a ballet slipper, you'll know this is a faint debasement to be forgotten in the weeks ahead. But as her skin brightens, flashing past punch, nearing violet, you recognize this as catastrophic. You question why you didn't insist your mother come in your father's stead. She knows better how to iron out her words for American airs as she must for work every day. Earlier in the week, you asked her about the details of her secretarial position. From the edge of your bed, your mother explained that she works in the office of a company that ships jet engines internationally. The hem of her nightie shimmied as she skipped across the room to pull down the globe from atop your bookcase. "You see here, and this here?" She kneeled at your bedside, pointing to Germany, then Brazil, then to the chain of Hawaiian islands, singing, "We go all around the world," dancing her slender index and middle fingers across oceans and lush green continents before lifting them to tap your nose. "We," you asked her. You don't get to go to these places, do you?" Your mother blinked twice, then walked the globe back to its shelf. "Someday," she said. "Someday, maybe when you're all grown up." She added, Better you ask your father to visit school. Him, they'll find exciting. And I think I'll end the reading on that note. As we see, I just want to kind of contextualize the opening a little bit and talk about where the story goes from there. And talk about this in the kind of context of beyond what's in the narrative of the book, and talking about the kind of Caribbean American experiences. So as we see at the beginning of the book, when Shalani's 9, he's asked that problematic question, what are you? That kind of abrasive, demanding, expectant question, what are you? And he's confronted with this question throughout childhood and into adulthood. And he doesn't appear to be able to answer this to anyone's satisfaction. And we see that as the question continues as a kind of constant refrain throughout especially that opening story, but without the book, throughout the book at large. And even as he attempts to lean into different aspects of his identity, if he says he's Black, people ask, well, how come he looks Latino or mixed? If he says he is mixed, people ask which of his parents is white, though the answer is neither. If he says he's Jamaican, they ask where his Jamaican accent is. Why is it missing? Why does he sound American? Part of his difficulty is that his parents haven't prepared him for these questions, because in their home country, these questions wouldn't have been asked and aren't asked. The irony of his parents coming from a majority, and I should also mention, as the story continues, just after the point I left off, there's a point where Chelani is returning to his mother and asking her, kind of internalizing this question, what am I? And he asks, am I Black? And his mother's initial answer is, you are a little of this and you're a little of that. And the irony of his parents coming from a majority Black country is that they've rarely had to think of themselves as Black and don't really know what that means in an American context, at least not at first. Of course, they're having lighter skin and coming from the Jamaican middle class adds to their potential for lack of awareness. It might help contextualize Jelani's parents' attitude about race to point out that Jamaica's national motto is out of many, one people. So when Chelani asks his mother, what am I? And she's quick to name those many ancestors of European descent, along with the ancestors of African descent, although she leans more on the European side, that contributed to making this one Jamaican family. It's almost like something that is being upheld through the national government. And at the same time, with his being the only family member born in the US, Chelani's parents refused to affirm his Jamaicanness, which becomes a big problem for him in the book. It's Chelani's older brother who is going through that primary and secondary education in the United States, along with Chelani, who first explains to him that he is in fact Black and he'd better accept and get used to it. But Chelani tries to construct his Blackness in a sense because he's not quite understanding what it means to be Black himself by doing comical things such as mirroring his peers' speech and manner of dress. And finally, as he's trying to attempt to construct this identity, we see a departure from where we saw him in those opening pages, where he was very patriotic and very quick to deny his Jamaicanness and the connection to Jamaica. And we see this kind of turn where he wants to be more Jamaican, and he is interested in the idea of escaping a racialized experience and existence by returning to Jamaica. I wanted to, in particular, look at the ways that identity and race are treated in a city like Miami, my hometown, where the Latin and Caribbean influence dominates the wider culture, and how that changes when Chelani moves to the upper Midwest for college. When he makes that movement from Florida to the Midwest, it's here that he begins to see that it's not just himself who has been trying to construct these different identities, but that whiteness as a marker of identity is largely a thing that is also constructed. And he's reminded of this when he sees his Latinx classmates struggle when their whiteness is challenged, and even his Jewish friends' whiteness is also challenged. And this is something that I witnessed a lot when I spent time in Minnesota as a graduate student pursuing my MFA. Trelawney continues to search for his footing for the duration of the book, but he comes to understand that his inability to fit in isn't due exclusively to any essential character flaw, but that it results from systems much bigger than he is and results from events that transpired long before he was born. And so one of the major plot point challenges for Trelawney is that he begins to think that maybe he can marry back into his Jamaicanness, which is also, kind of a comical thing. But he has this idea that he can escape America and he can escape that racialized experience. But along with that, which is one thing, and if you haven't traveled to a majority Black country, I recommend it as a Black person. It's an interesting thing to look around and see that you are part of that majority, and to see the racialization kind of, if it doesn't change, or if I should say, if it doesn't lift off altogether, then it certainly changes. But Trelawney comes to really judge his parents' decision to leave Jamaica in the first place and put him in this position where he can not quite be Jamaican enough for them, but also not quite be or find himself being treated as American enough for his peers or the people in his surroundings or larger society. I think Trelawney understands intellectually that his parents' choice to emigrate to the US was about prioritizing physical safety. But at the same time, his father denies him that Jamaicanness, and his father is upset with him that he would question his parents' decision to move to the United States. And at the same time, Trelawney viscerally understands that he was born in a country that sees him as a problem. So he begins to internalize that idea of himself as the problem. And I think panning out from the book in a statistical sense, the difficult thing for a lot of us to contend with is looking at disparate projected life outcomes based on race. It can be a very disheartening thing if you put a lot of stock into it on a personal level. We can also consider the physical and psychological toll of knowing your life outcomes will likely be hindered because of systemic violence perpetrated against your race. So I see the Openness story in Flux as an example of this psychological toll in action. Trelawney constantly redefines himself through or against the gaze of others as a means of survival. And on one hand, he is resilient in doing so, but I also think he needs to do this, or I think the fact that he needs to do this or feels the need to do this is debilitating. I wonder about the question of what else could he have become had he not had to spend his life constantly navigating others' assessments of him. To some extent, he believes that if he could just fit in somewhere, anywhere, that he could be safe. The issues that eat away at his self-esteem aren't precisely shared by his family members because they come from a place where many of the people in power look like them, and they can return to this place where they quote unquote fit, at least theoretically. Some might argue that Trelawney's hyper-awareness of this position, his positionality, is his biggest problem. Perhaps he's perpetuating a self-fulfilling prophecy, or what we often hear stated as a victim mindset. And I'm really interested in that conversation, particularly in the context of Black immigrants and their American-born children. I'm interested in how many generations can use a kind of willful ignorance about America's structural problems and the toll it takes on them directly to their advantage before it all starts to catch up to them through their children and their grandchildren. And I think some further context of the book as it's taking place, and also my experience of some of these questions, is that I grew up in the pre-internet age, essentially, in the 1980s and the 1990s. And I wanted to capture the attitudes of those decades. I remember so many racism is over, quote unquote, conversations, and the United States stance on race is that we don't see race. And there were so many of those conversations happening in and out of school and on television, just as one example. These were problematic conversations, to be clear, or at least the conclusions were problematic. But I think it makes sense that a character like Trelawney, who is confused about so many of these questions, comes out of a decade in which the national conversation about race is that we don't see it. And so no wonder this kid has been set up to be confused about his identity. I think it's important that our literature captures the evolution of these kinds of conversations so that we remember what's come before and what clearly has not worked and what's led us to our present moment. So as a Jamaican American, or as somebody to put it in specifics, as someone who was born in the United States to Jamaican parents who emigrated, and this is speaking of myself, I am interested in the question of the value of carrying forward that, to be specific, Jamaican or Jamaican American identity. And we can pan that out to Caribbean American identity. What's the value of that? And is that a worthy project? I was struck by the fact that as a historical benchmark, when Vice President Kamala Harris was elected, the headlines listed every aspect of her identity being a monumental moment in history, as the first Black woman VP, the first South Asian VP, and so on and so forth. So many firsts. But if you have any kind of investment in a Caribbean identity, or in particular a Jamaican identity, Jamaican American identity, you might have noticed that the one marker of identity that was not in the headlines was that she would have been the first, or she would have been the Jamaican American, as someone whose father was Jamaican, or who that did not make the headlines. And so the question I have is, what again is that value of wearing that keeping that Jamaicanness? In a political sense, I can imagine any number of reasons why that isn't something that is highlighted. And yet it depends to me if we're talking about Jamaica as a nationality, or are we talking about Jamaicanness as ethnicity, as something that would carry forward with you beyond possibly that first emigrating generation. The reason I have these questions is because I think about the different ways in which Afro-Caribbean Americans, Black Americans, African Americans can think about the ways in which, particularly in our early development, we gain self-esteem. And so often when we're thinking about, I can think of an example of, we've just come out of Black History Month, and we would normally think about the various African-American historical figures who have contributed to the building of this country. And if you are, again, grappling with those questions of thinking of myself in this context of as a Black American, as somebody who was born in this country, who walks around as a Black man in this country, who has had this American experience, but who's also coming out of a Jamaican household, who was told the history of Jamaica growing up, who shares, in a sense, those stories of my parents. Where do I find the self-esteem as that son of Jamaicans? And for me as a younger person, I know that I like to look to, I'm a fan of hip hop. And so looking to the early pioneers of hip hop, rap music, like thinking of Cool Herc, and then moving into the 90s, thinking of Busta Rhymes and the Notorious B.I.G., grappling for these figures who might help to establish the fact that we, us sons of the Caribbean and us sons and children and daughters and so on of the Caribbean, have these people to look back towards who have made these major contributions. For me, it was easy to think about the way musical influences played a part. But when, I could sit here and list a number of celebrities in a sense. And again, in a way, it becomes very comical to me, the way I might say, well, this person and this person and that person is of Jamaican or Caribbean heritage. What I'm really interested in, though, is like, how do we, and again, if we think this is a worthy project to carry forward, that kind of Caribbean identity or Caribbean American identity, thinking about how to do that in an unproblematic way, a way that does not have to draw solid boundaries around ourselves, because that can be, to me, that's the worst possible outcome of exploring our Caribbean identities. And so I like to look to a Marcus Garvey, for example, the great Pan-Africanist and his movement throughout the Americas, and the part he played in lifting the North American Black self-esteem in the early parts of the 20th century. I like to remember that one of Malcolm X's parents was from the Caribbean. Thinking about figures who played a major part in the upliftment of Black America have been Caribbean. And again, I don't say that or mention that to draw a divide, but I think it's important that we remember that our destinies have always been tied up with one another, and finding ways that we can remember that without drawing boundaries between ourselves, I think is very, very important. And there are other ways in which we, of course, try to carry forward our culture. I think it's a really interesting thing that for the Anglophone Caribbean, the English-speaking Caribbean, we don't have language. We often, for the most part, don't pass forward language in a similar way that Spanish-speaking Caribbean islands and cultures do. And but we do have that attachment with the food and the music, and thinking about ways that we can continue those traditions, I think could be of value. But again, I think as a fiction writer, I'm always a little bit more interested in the questions rather than the answers. And so I think we're at about the time where we should be opening up for questions, if there are any, whether they're about the book or just these ideas about how identity is formed, I think, in a general sense. And we can take it from there.
Thank you so very much, Jonathan. That was truly, those were so many jewels of knowledge that you shared with us. Wonderful questions that your text asks, wonderful ideas that your text proposes, wonderful things that you're sharing with us verbally in the here and now of things. It truly is a fascinating thing to consider and to puzzle over and to mull on how exactly identity operates. Since we are led to believe in America that race is something that both does and does not exist with immediate concern and relevance, where people will tell you that they don't have a racist bone in their body, but then at the same time be a part of things. the old adage of I don't have a racist bone in my body, but then at the same time they'll be complicit with all of these things that are utterly and completely defined by race.
Right.
And so how do we as people sort of navigate those spaces? How do we as people, whether we're born and raised in America and countryside of North Florida or whatever, or whether we are from Jamaica or whether we are from Africa or wherever. And I think that these are really, really necessary and important questions for us to pick up on, unpack, and explore. And in speaking of questions, I do hope that the audience knows that we are more than happy to entertain a number of questions that are submitted through the chat. I'll be in the process of trying to convey your questions to Jonathan. We have a limited amount of time, so I'll try to convey as many of them to Jonathan as possible and get his responses. It looks like we have several questions that have popped up in the Q&A. A number of them that are giving you shout outs, of course, very interesting and great job. We've got other folks that are representing other parts of the Caribbean. We got one of our faculty members here on campus, mainland Caribbean, Belize, woohoo. So, and then
Hey.
Shay, definitely, right? And there's a student who was posing more of a comment than a question. The student was saying something to the effect of, this is a great topic. I am a Haitian American growing up in Central Florida. I have been generally accepted in my diverse community of Caribbean, Hispanic, and American children. It was not until, not really until college that I felt quote unquote excluded from what it meant to be Black, as in diaspora American. And again, I mean, I think that your novel really deals specifically with Anglophone experiences. And that question of language really is one that we can't really ignore in terms of how that defines how you experience America. As you spoke to in the novel, right? I mean, the question of what language is your mother speaking? It's English, of course. And
Right.
but this question of English versus broken English, or whatever people will describe this as being potentially problematic. Here's a question for you though. I'm so sorry. I'm so enthused. I'm really sort of channeling positive energy about this.
I appreciate it.
Question that you got was, do you think returning to your parents' home country would strengthen your sense of identity? And I suppose this is directed towards you or towards what we imagine Trelawney might experience or whatever.
Right. Yeah, I mean, I think yes and no in a way. I mean, I think it'll strengthen your ideas about your identity, whichever way that goes. And so I know that for myself, when growing up in Miami, and I mean, one thing to, it's like I try to make it clear from the reading and the text, but you can only read so much and so many excerpts at an event such as this. And so, my experience of growing up in Miami is that people, no matter where they're from, and including, people who were in Miami for multiple generations, everyone was very adamant about wearing their heritage on their sleeve. I don't think that's a bad thing at all. When I was approached with that question, what are you? Which again, I think is a poorly worded question. And often, it was done at times that were really inappropriate. But essentially people were trying to get to different things. One of those things is they wanted to know if like where my parents were from. And so if sometimes when I would say Jamaican, that would be a kind of satisfactory answer, sometimes not. So it could at times for me be very easy to walk around and almost like expect that question from people. And then when it comes, as I anticipate it, I might jump straight to Jamaican. Going to Jamaica, I've never felt so American. You know what I mean? Like you step off the plane, you come out, there's the taxis everywhere, taxi drivers are everywhere shouting at you, trying to get you to, trying to get your fare. And I'm going in a couple of months back to Jamaica, but I haven't been there for a few years. And, every time I go after a few years, every time I let a few years slip by before I go back, it's always startling at first. And I, I have to, every time I speak, the accent that I speak with, everyone's like, oh yeah, they see me and they're like, I would have assumed you might have been Jamaican, but I hear you. Oh yeah, you're American or you're a Yankee or however they phrase it. But at the same time, I mean, again, I think after a little bit of time that a week goes by, if I'm fortunate enough to spend 2 weeks there, I start to really feel a kind of comfort level sink in. And I start to, because it's, even though I don't sound like my parents, unless I attempt to, and then I poorly sound like my parents. Everyone in Jamaica, not everyone, but people in Jamaica in a kind of approximate way sound like my parents, and so everyone sounds like family when I go to Jamaica, and the what they cook in their households is very much like my family in the U.S. And certain attitudes, the attitudes I agree with and the attitudes I don't agree with, might reflect some of what I've gotten from my own family. And so there is a way in which it's like, oh yeah, I'm very Jamaican in this way, but then it's like I'm very American, in all these other ways, having lived here all of my life. And so I think it's a complex thing. My nationality is American. My race is Black. My ethnicity, though, I believe, is Jamaican, and that's that is my understanding of how these things, how I might parse these things, these markers of identity.
Which is really fascinating too, because again, as you mentioned, so often people don't look at Jamaican as being an ethnicity. They look at it solely as being a nationality. Right. You look at other folks from other non-white nations across the world, and people can say, I'm Chinese, I'm Japanese, I'm Korean.
Absolutely.
And people will accept that as an ethnic identity as well as a national identity, or depending on the context. Right. It's strange the way that Jamaica in particular, and the Caribbean more broadly, kind of gets read out of that kind of conversation, perhaps.
Absolutely. Yeah. I look to my, I don't know, because sometimes I think, well, okay, as a colonized nation, is it just the fact of that kind of colonization? It's like, no, we can't say that, all these other nations were also colonized. India, for example. Is it the newness of the nation as we know it? And it's like, no, but if I look at, 3 generations of New Yorkers or Puerto Ricans, in New York, it's treated differently. You know what I mean? There's a kind of like, there's like almost like a respect or an acknowledgement of that being that ethnicity being validated in a way that I don't feel like Jamaican heritage is, or Jamaican as an ethnicity is. I do think we have some part to play in that as Jamaicans, though. And, part of that is that our parents, I had this conversation with my parents and my one sibling. I think Jamaicans in a way have a way of wanting you to be proud of your heritage, but also in a way safeguarding the culture from you. And because they'll be the first ones to say, you're not Jamaican. You know what I mean? Like if you criticize something that's directly impactful to them, they'll be like, what do you mean? Like we're Jamaican, you should be proud of it. But at the same time, if they're the first ones who deny you that, then it can be very difficult to move forth with the kind of confidence in that identity. Yeah,
that's this. It's really fascinating answers to these deeply conundrums, I think.
Right.
So as we look through some of the other points in the Q&A, we've got a number of things that are saying. We've got one that says, sounds like an amazing book. I can't wait to read. My granddad is from Barbados, and I have heard him explain to me his own struggles with identity and accepting American culture while staying true to his own background and the way, again, gatekeeping of it and who has access to these identities and whatnot, and so on and so forth. Also, I can kind of speak to this a little bit in a roundabout sort of way myself. My wife's grandfather is directly from the Bahamas. I joke with my wife all the time. I say, oh, so when is the Bahamas Independence Day? She's like, I don't know when that is. And it's like a thing that gets lost over time. And, right. Now my son has Bahamian in him, generations removed, but what do I know about that? I know a couple of other questions that have just sort of asked you directly about identity and how that's manifest in your life. One that's asked, in your own experience, what are some ways that you overcame the struggle with being Jamaican American? How do you personally identify as Black Jamaican or American? I think that these are interesting questions, and raise some concerns. If you feel comfortable to speak on these, if that's something that you'd like to share with us about your personal identity and whatnot, I think students are kind of curious about it, it seems.
Yeah, it's interesting. I'll speak to, I can just list what how I identify it. I think it'd be maybe more helpful to tell you about a conversation I just had 2 days ago, and then move that back towards how I identify. I was speaking with, it was as a result of this event. You put me in contact with with a journalist. We had a wonderful conversation. He identified himself as having emigrated from the Caribbean. He didn't tell me where exactly in the Caribbean, and to be honest, I did not ask. But what he did say was that I left my home country as a man, and America taught me that I was a Black man. Mm-hmm. And I think that is, again, speaking to that thing where I think it can be contentious between people who have, I mean, especially the first generation who have emigrated to the US, especially coming from a Black nation. And I've heard African authors, Nigerian authors write about this. Chimamanda Adichie Ngozi has talked about this, like a Nigerian coming here and learning they're Black in America. You know what I mean? And I think from our historical, when I say our this time, I'm talking about like as a Black American, it's when we see Black people of African descent, or people who are literally emigrating from the continent, saying that they have a difficult time coming into their Blackness or accepting their Blackness, or however they phrase it, whether they phrase it in the most nuanced way or the most unnuanced way, there's a visceral reaction. It's like, well, what do you mean you're not Black? It's offensive. It's, America has a history of people coming to this country and trying to get a leg up off of the backs of Black Americans. But I think, if we could, my hope, and part of this project of the book, though, is writing. So there's a point that I mentioned in the book where Trelawney's mom says, you're a little of this and you're a little of that. And the implication is she's saying, I'm a little of this and I'm a little of that, speaking of herself. And then he has a conversation with her 20 years later, and she says, you know what? America is too hard for a Black woman, this Black woman, and I am going back to Jamaica. I'm moving back. It's too hard. It's too complicated. And it's that time. It's like you spend the time, you live you move through the country as a Black body, and you learn that Black experience as Blackness has been constructed in this country, and all the things it means. And that's not to say, I mean, obviously I'm talking about the struggle parts. There's also the wonderful things that come out of Black American culture. And I hate for that to ever get lost. And I think, one wonderful thing that comes out of our culture is that us as Black Americans are the absolute best on the planet about talking about race and structural issues of this sort. And also in the same way that I mentioned Marcus Garvey as this Jamaican Marcus Garvey was able to come to the United States to have his project of Pan-Africanism because of the struggles and successes of Black Americans before him. And then he was able to contribute in his way. And I think Black America has done this wonderful job globally of lifting the self-esteem of the entire diaspora in the ways that we do through media and American culture. So getting back to that conversation, that learning to be Black in America, I think sometimes there's this conflation of Blackness as the race and African American ethnicity as its in itself has been an idea. It's like when the words African American first came to the forefront, it was to solidify this particular experience. And for me, it gets complicated because I've been reading Jamaican scholars who are actually trying to do the work of helping us see one another as part of one diaspora. It's not, if you go to Jamaica, the attitude is not that Jamaicans and African Americans are the same, but the scholarship is trying to point out, like, our ancestors came off, like, at times literally the same ship. You know, they dropped some in Jamaica on their way over to the continent. And so, you know, in that regards, it's like, again, if I take a DNA I've done this stupid stuff, it will say most recent ancestry is Jamaican. But, and then some people think that's junk science anyway, so I don't want to get too deep into that. My lived experience has mostly been as a Black American and racially identify as Black. And I'm American, so I am Black American. That's typically how but I also identify as Jamaican American. So to me, it only makes sense if there's both. And I'm comfortable saying one or the other, but I can't deny one or the other.
Sure.
Hope that wasn't too rambling.
No, that was fantastic. I just am seeing a couple of questions in the Q&A, but unfortunately, I know that we're almost at time. Thankfully, your questions actually answered, or at least addressed some of these. There was a question that was posed: do you feel unsafe today as a Black man in this country? There was another one that I thought was interesting that we're not really going to have too much time to dig too deep into, but it actually was paralleling some of the thoughts that I had. The question was asking about Trelawney's experience as being light-skinned and having that kind of privilege associated with that.
Yeah.
And one of the questions that I actually had in thinking about the things that you've been saying is the way that this also is a question of intersectionality, not only about ethnic identity, national identity, racial identity, but also about gendered identity. Because pretty much everybody in the story is a dude. And those kinds of experiences, particularly the rather outlandish experiences, the sexcapades that Trelawney finds himself getting into, I mean, they're very much coded and overdetermined by his maleness. And so I don't know, maybe there'll be another time for answering or entertaining those questions. I'm sorry we didn't get a chance to all of them, but it is 1:30, and we really want to say thank you so much, Jonathan, for your time. On behalf of everybody, myself, all of the committee members in the Lit Forum committee, everybody in the Department of English and Modern Languages, everybody in the College of Social Sciences, Arts and Humanities, everybody who helped to make this possible at all, we genuinely want to say thank you for spending some time with us this afternoon/morning for you. And it's been a truly, truly productive conversation, a fascinating one where I hope that we've all learned a lot. And I think everybody's going to join in giving a little digital round of applause for you as it relates to this. And we'll let Dr. Yan close us out, and then we'll look to say our so longs and farewells.
Well, Dr. Brickler, you pretty much closed us out, but thank you for sharing with us today. Thank you to everyone who had a part in putting this program together, and students. I'm not sure if some of you may have missed this part, but early on in Mr. Escoffery's talk, he discussed how he came to write this novel. And the minute you mentioned, Escoffery, that you wanted to write a book that you wanted to see, that you looked in these other books and you didn't find yourself in those, the quote that came to mind, or the saying that came to mind, was "be the change you want to see." And so I think that is a strong message in your experience, and something that all of our students can take away from this as they continue their academic pursuits at the university and beyond, to be the change that you want to see. If you don't see something out there, why duplicate something that someone else is doing? Utilize your own experiences, utilize your own resources, and put that out there. And so again, I thank you for that lesson that you imparted to our students. And I encourage the students to pick up a copy if you don't have it. If I Survive You by Jonathan Escoffery. It has definitely been a pleasure to meet you and to have a little chat with you beforehand. Students, he did give a shout out to FAMU in the novel. So the next time you go to homecoming, and think about a student, a high schooler, still in his father's vehicle and driving 8 hours to FAMU for homecoming. So thank you so much for that shout out. And again, have a blessed day, everyone. We appreciate your coming out to the 15th annual Spring Literary Forum. Thank you.
Thank you all.
Thank you. You all have a great one.